The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody.
Well, Beth, we made it to another wedding anniversary.
We made it to the anniversary and beyond.
As many of you probably don't know, we always record on a Sunday evening. And by the time you listen to this, it'll be Wednesday. But we had our wedding anniversary today, and we had a pretty good day.
We did. We went grocery shopping, and then we looked at hamsters at PetSmart. Well, we tried.
That we did. Yeah, they're all hiding, the little monsters.
Yeah, so we couldn't really see them. Not that we really want a hamster. We just think they're cute.
Yeah, I keep seeing all those TikTok videos of these little golden hamsters dressed in all kinds of little outfits. It just cracks me up.
So we've been looking, just looking.
Yeah, I don't want one.
I don't either. And yet we keep looking.
Well, it's all right to look.
Yes. And then we had a delicious dinner.
That we did.
And now here we are sitting across from each other.
I know. Getting ready to record our episode.
It's a good place to be.
That it is. And speaking of good places to be, if you haven't already, please go to your favorite listening platform and leave us a comment and a 5-star review. Now, the comment really does seem to make a lot of difference. I don't know why. I don't know how the algorithms work. But just leave anything. You can just say, I like it. Do a thumbs up. Anything. But a review and a comment seems to go a long way in moving us up the list, because it helps to get new listeners.
It does, and we appreciate it. We've gotten some reviews over the years that have really made us feel quite good.
I know, and it's been a little while. So if you please could, go ahead and do that for us. We'd greatly appreciate it.
It would be our wedding anniversary present from you to us.
Wow. That's kind of guilting people into leaving us a comment. It might work.
It might work, though.
It might very well work. I'd take that. So you know what? We're not going to do any housekeeping this episode. I know we say that once in a while, but let's just get right into it because we have more planned for this evening.
Yeah, we have a good episode lined up for everybody, I think.
That we do. And you want to go crochet after?
I don't crochet.
Knit, crochet. What's the difference?
One has a hook needle and one has 2 straight needles.
Well, there you learn something new every day. Something that I really even care to know about.
Well, now you do, since I'm knitting you a scarf.
Oh, that you are?
Yeah.
Well, let's get into tonight's episode. It's a really good one.
All right.
Back to 2 stories.
Yes. Roosevelt Island in the East River of New York City, between Manhattan and Queens, has had many names. It's also been visited by many famous people who didn't exactly have very many nice things to say about it. Today, people who live on the island say that it's haunted. They've heard disembodied voices, seen unexplained lights, and come upon several apparitions. And based on the island's dark history, it makes total sense that the entire island would be haunted. Originally, the 2-mile-long, 800-foot-wide, 147-square-acre island was called Minnehannock by the Canarsie people. When Wouter van Twiller, the Director General of the New Amsterdam colony, purchased it from the Canarsie people, it was renamed Varken Island, or Hog Island, because the Dutch settlers used it as an area to raise their hogs, according to Atlas Obscura. In the 1660s, it was renamed Manning's Island, after British Captain John Manning, who was the sheriff of New York. In 1673, Captain Manning surrendered the colony back to the Dutch, and he was considered a disgrace. He was court-martialed, and his sword was broken in front of City Hall as a form of public punishment. He was sent to live on the island in isolation, and it was said that his chief form of entertainment was, quote, a bowl of rum punch. Manning's daughter, Mary, married Robert Blackwell in 1717, and together they built a home on the island, which, by the way, today is considered the 6th oldest house in New York City. Their family lived there into the 1800s, despite trying numerous times to sell the island. On July 19, 1828, the city of New York purchased Blackwell Island through a foreclosure for $52,500. They bought it with the purpose of creating an island of charitable and corrective institutions. In other words, a city of asylums, according to correctionhistory.com. The foreclosure was later ruled illegal, but at that point, not much could be done. The penitentiary on Blackwell Island opened in 1832. It was 600 feet long and 4 stories tall. It basically looked like a castle, but contained a little more than 800 cells. By 1848, additions had been added, and the penitentiary housed over 1,000 inmates, many of whom had misdemeanor sentences. By the early 1900s, the prison was overcrowded, and both riots and escape attempts were common. Reports came out that people were breaking doors off their hinges as makeshift rafts, and gangs of nude men swam for their freedom. In 1914, the first woman to ever head a New York City agency, Catherine Davis, called the prison, quote, vile, inhumane, wet, slimy, dark, and foul, end quote. That same year, half of the now 1,400 prisoners joined together in an uprising that lasted for days. According to correctionhistory.com, the prison was so lax in discipline that in the 1930s, 2 prison mobsters, Edward Cleary and Joseph Rao, kept homing pigeons for carrying messages and drug smuggling. Mobster Joseph Rao actually turned the prison hospital into his headquarters, where he wore silk shirts and silk dressing gowns on a daily basis, bathed in lilac-scented water, and kept a pet goat. His messages were written on monogrammed stationery.
That's so strange.
Yeah, he just took it over. Actress and singer Mae West was incarcerated at the prison for 10 days in April of 1927 after being found guilty of, quote, corrupting the morals of youth in her Broadway play, Sex. Whether she deserved to be imprisoned or not for the play she had written and starred in might be up for a debate, but she told reporters that during her 10 days, she dined with the warden and his wife, and that she wore her silk panties the whole time, not the burlap underwear that other female inmates were made to wear. her daily work chores consisted of dusting off the books in the prison library. Upon her release, she donated the $1,000 she made giving interviews to the prison and set up the Mae West Memorial Prison Library. West's stories about her time in the prison wasn't what New York City authorities wanted to hear. Responding to public outcry about the conditions there, they had officially changed the name of the island once again, just 7 years earlier, from Blackwell Island to Welfare Island. Welfare Island had at least 6 buildings in its city of asylums, including the charity hospital, the prison, an almshouse, a workhouse, a hospital for incurables, mostly smallpox, a chapel, a lighthouse, and the asylum. I'll get into the asylum in a second, but first I want to mention that all of those buildings were constructed by the inmates themselves. The 3-story Blackwell workhouse was built in 1852 and contained 221 cells. Most of the inmates were considered drunks and disorderlies and spent their shorter sentences doing menial labor. According to the Library of Congress blog's website, the hospital for the incurables was generally used to isolate smallpox victims from 1856 until 1875, with about 7,000 patients each year. In 1875, the building was turned into a nurses' dormitory, and the smallpox hospital was set up on North Brothers Island. So, at any given time, there were close to 10,000 people on that tiny little island. All right, the Blackwell Asylum. According to psychiatryonline.org, the asylum was the first publicly funded mental hospital and the first municipal mental hospital in the entire United States. Initially, Dr. John McDonald, one of the asylum's designers, wanted the building to be both organized and orderly. He wanted all of the patients to be classified into one of 4 groups. Now, you have to keep in mind this was the 1800s, so the labels given to people with mental health issues and physical disabilities were not kind. So the 4 groups were noisy, destructive, and violent, the idiots, the convalescents, and an intermediate class for those in the first stages of convalescence and such incurables who are harmless and not possessed of bad habits. We would never use that sort of classification today, but that's how they spoke about people then.
That they did.
Yeah. He also wanted the focus to be on humane treatments, ample rest, and unrestricted access to the outdoors. He didn't want a single iron bar on any door or window, and he refused the idea of any inner barricades. So, although he was using the terminology of the time, he was progressive in his thoughts about mental health and wanted to do it right by our standards.
Well, it's almost as though they named them literally what people would describe them as being.
Right. But he wanted what was best for people. That was the impression I got.
Yes.
Unfortunately, finances were a huge issue, and only 2 wings of the asylum were built before it opened and was filled to capacity. Women outnumbered men 2-1, and inmates from the penitentiary were used as guards and attendants. Between 1839 and 1895, thousands of people were admitted to the asylum, and it seemed like a favorite pastime for local papers to print stories about various patients. Although it may have been done to garner sympathy, it's hard to read some of the stories without thinking that a good number of New York City's general population may not have read them with kind hearts. An example comes from Harper's Weekly, which ran the following story. Quote, "Most people have heard of Mrs. Buchanan. She is one of the incurables, a poor old lady, Scotch, I imagine, who has been an inmate of the lunatic asylum for years. Her delusion has been described in the papers. She believes she is the wife of the president and discharges her conjugal duties with such success that she bears a large family to the president. Strange to say, the offspring of her lofty amour are invariably cats. I had the honor of stroking the back of President Buchanan's eldest son, who purred as though his sire had no political difficulties to disturb his repose." So, to be honest, I don't know why they printed stories like that, unless, on one hand, it was a way to further isolate the patients there from the general society, or to kind of deter general society from, quote, misbehaving so they didn't end up being sent there. Author Charles Dickens visited the asylum in 1842. He wrote in part, quote, "Everything had a lounging, listless, madhouse air, which was very painful. The hideous laugh and pointed finger, the vacant eye, the fierce, wild face, the gloomy picking of the hands and lips, and munching of the nails. There they were all, without disguise, in naked ugliness and horror." End quote. In 1866, Harper's Weekly reported that the patients spent their days catching lobsters, tending their vegetable gardens, playing cards, and building furniture. The men were dressed in navy blue outfits, and the women all wore calico dresses. But then they added a bit to the article about a woman who, despite her calico dress, held one arm up at an angle and the other on her hip for hours all day long because she believed that she was a teapot. The story, when I read that, sounds to me exactly like the "I'm a little teapot" rhyme. So I was curious and I Googled it because I thought if everybody knew that rhyme, that, quote, reporter might have printed that because it was something that people could relate to, and it doesn't mean it was true. But that rhyme didn't come out for another 70 years. So I don't think they were trying to be funny, but they didn't mind belittling and disrespecting women, that's for sure. And someone else seemed to agree with me back in 1887. A 23-year-old young woman named Elizabeth Cochran Seaman, who went by the pen name Nellie Bly. Hired at Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, New York World, Bly would become a household name after just her first assignment. To feign insanity and be admitted to the asylum for 10 days so she could report on what was really happening. Both Pulitzer and the World's managing editor, Colonel John A. Cockrell, promised her that they would get her out after 10 days. Now, I can't even imagine putting myself in that situation where you're trusting that these two men are going to indeed get you out after 10 days, especially since a lot of the women at that time were committed just for being, difficult.
Yeah, and especially if she's trying to move up the ladder in the newspaper. That's taking a chance.
I know. So, according to the Library of Congress blog's website, Bly used the name Nellie Brown during her initial meeting at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. There, she met with the matron Irene Stannard and several of the institution's doctors, as well as 2 police officers. In that meeting, she was able to convince everyone present that she was suffering from mental health concerns. They all agreed that the best place for her was Blackwell Island. At this point, all of the male patients at Blackwell's asylum had been moved to a new facility on Ward's Island, and Blackwell housed only female patients. Bly later wrote, quote, "But here, let me say one thing. From the moment I entered the insane ward on the island, I made no attempt to keep up the assumed role of insanity. I talked and acted just as I do in normal life. Yet, strange to say, the more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier I was thought to be by all except one physician whose kindness and gentle ways I shall not soon forget." End quote. Can you imagine?
No.
She drops the facade as soon as she gets in the place, and everybody thinks that she belongs there, even though she's speaking sanely and rationally. And
Well, once you're in there, you're in there. They don't care. You're just another person.
right, that's what I'm saying. It's amazing that she would trust those 2 men to get her out.
Well, I wonder how many people went in and then maybe did better, and they just remained there. They never got out.
I think most of them.
Yes, more than likely.
According to the Library of Congress site and Atlas Obscura, Bly referred to the asylum as a, quote, "human rat trap," and witnessed horrifying neglect and abuse during her 10-day stay. She claimed the doctors were oblivious to the patient's needs and that massive orderlies, quote, "choked, beat, and harassed" patients. She felt strongly that anyone who wasn't insane would be after dealing with the enforced isolation, rancid food, dirty linens, and buckets of ice water that were routinely dumped over patients' heads. At the end of the 10 days, despite Pulitzer and Cockrell's insistence that Bly was completely competent and should be released, it still took the work of an attorney to actually see her released. Her articles and later her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, actually led to important reforms in how patients were treated in care facilities. Now, with the prison and the workhouse and the hospitals and the asylum, you'd think that tiny Blackwell Island had about all it could take when it comes to buildings and outbuildings and population. But what it also really needed was a lighthouse. Boats traveling down the East River needed a decent lighthouse to help them navigate the Hell Gate waters. Hell Gate, also known as Hurl Gate, is a very narrow strait between Ward's Island and Astoria, Queens, filled with jagged rocks and whirlpools. The city commissioned the 50-foot lighthouse on Blackwell Island in 1872. According to LighthouseFriends.com, it was undoubtedly built by the prison inmates, based on architect James Renwick Jr.'s design. But the plaque at its base created quite a mystery. It read, quote, "This work was done by John McCarthy, who built the lighthouse from the bottom to the top. All ye who do pass by may pray for his soul when he dies." End quote. You see, there was a legend surrounding John McCarthy and fellow asylum patient Thomas Maxey. One of the 2 men allegedly feared that the British might try to invade New York by way of the East River, and he had built a 4-foot-high clay fort. since he was actually helping to reclaim some of the marshy land around the fort, the prison officials on Blackwell Island encouraged his fort building and even gave him 2 cannons to put one on either side of this fort. The city wanted this brand new lighthouse to sit exactly where McCarthy's or Maxey's fort was, and prison officials ended up either bribing him somehow or persuading him somehow to demolish the fort that he had built. But it was inmate Thomas Maxey who may have actually built the lighthouse. Calling himself Thomas Maxey Esquire, architect, mason, carpenter, civil engineer, philosopher, and philanthropist, Maxey always claimed that he had built it. The confusion over the lighthouse deepens with the plaque at the bottom that states that McCarthy built it, because there are no records that indicate that either a John McCarthy or a Thomas Maxey ever existed. The plaque itself, by the way, mysteriously disappeared in the 1960s. By 1921, as I had said earlier, Blackwell Island had been renamed Welfare Island, and the asylum was shut down and repurposed as the Metropolitan Hospital. By 1935, the prisoners on the island were moved to Rikers, and by the 1940s, the lighthouse was decommissioned. The buildings sat, crumbling and decaying, until the 1960s. Some were completely demolished. And then the idea of redeveloping Welfare Island into a residential community was brought up. Renamed once again in 1972 to honor former President Roosevelt, the island seemed like the perfect spot to offer New Yorkers a home. Linked to the mainland by both a bridge and a tramway, it was both convenient and tranquil. I mean, after all, you'd be living on your own island, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The first housing complexes on Roosevelt Island opened to the public in 1975. According to a Ranker article published in 2021, the former asylum was pretty much a ruin, except for its massive, impressive main entrance, an octagon-shaped domed structure. Purchased in the year 2000 by a redevelopment company, the former asylum is now known simply as the Octagon. And for $2,500 a month, you can rent a luxury studio apartment inside of it, and 500 plus people have done just that. I had said at the top of my story that Roosevelt Island has had many names, which it most certainly has. And I also mentioned that it's rumored to be quite haunted. Now, Roosevelt Island is one of those places where everybody says it's haunted. It's on all the lists, it's on all the websites, but finding specific first-person accounts of the hauntings or any specific accounts is not easy. All of the sites that I looked at alluded to disembodied voices, unexplained sounds, unexplained lights, and apparitions. And yet, very frustratingly, I wasn't able to find anything specific. Just vague paragraphs about how the island is widely known as the most haunted place in New York City. Nicknamed the Island of Lost Souls, that's not surprising. And maybe it is haunted, but maybe, unlike the newspapers of the 1800s, the residents who live there now feel that the former residents of the island deserve respect, and so they don't share their paranormal encounters with the media. maybe they feel protective of the spirits that are there. Or maybe the island isn't haunted at all, and over time, people have tried to hype it as being haunted because they feel like it should be. In that case, I kind of hope it is, or I should say in this case, I kind of hope that that's not it. I personally hope that all the souls that were there were able to move on and find peace.
It's quite the place. And to think, as nasty as those waters were around it, naked prisoners jumped in trying to escape and make their way to land.
That's how desperate they were because of how atrocious it was there.
I know. It's pretty sad. And to think about it, I mean, we've spoke about this before. Back then, you could be put away for just about anything. It makes you believe that like 90% of today's population would be in an asylum back then.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could be, right? I mean, if you were an unmarried woman and you were reading books.
Right.
I mean, I'm not being facetious. I'm being honest or serious that was something that made people turn their heads.
Yeah, there's so much that back then could just land you into an asylum.
Yeah.
And that was it. You weren't coming back out again.
And that's the thing, is that it wasn't just the asylum on this island. It was the prison and the incurables hospital and the asylum and the workhouse. It was all there on that one island.
Right. But it doesn't seem as though there were any children there, like many asylums.
I did not come across anything about children there.
Right.
So that's one saving grace. That doesn't mean there weren't, but I didn't come across anything. Huh.
Great story, dear.
I know.
And we'll be back right after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? Scientists have just discovered what may have caused Neanderthals to become extinct. By sequencing the genomes of people who lived between 120,000 and 20,000 years ago, they determined that Neanderthals had a rare blood group that made it impossible for them to successfully produce offspring with each other, Denisovans, or Homo sapiens. This inability to propagate their species undoubtedly led to their extinction. Today, modern humans who are part of this extremely rare blood group can receive antibodies that result in healthy offspring. Who'da thunk? All right, we're back, and I'm anxious to know what you're going to be telling us about tonight.
Well, I don't want to give any of our listeners a hint about it because it might give it away. So I'm just going to get right into it. The fruit, Lycopersicon esculentum, can turn your blood into acid if you eat it. Translated, it means poisonous wolf peach. And even its leaves and stems can poison you. For centuries, people avoided this fruit, fearful of the horrible ways it could poison a person. In fact, dozens, if not hundreds of people died after consuming it. Even when the more adventurous foodies throughout history claimed that this poison apple's seeds held powers of divination if ingested, and that it was an incredible aphrodisiac, people stayed far away from this wolf peach, especially since no one knew if this fruit was really a fruit at all or something else entirely. Well, what if I told you that the poisonous wolf peach comes in over 10,000 varieties, and you probably ate one in the last week and didn't even know it? Tonight, for my half of the episode, I'm going to tell all of you about the horribly misunderstood wolf peach, otherwise known as the common tomato.
We had tomatoes with dinner.
That we did.
We had a poisonous wolf peach with our dinner.
Yeah, and you're still here to talk about it.
I am.
According to PlanetNatural.com, people in colonial America wouldn't go anywhere near the tomato, even though they grew them in their gardens and used them as decorations in their homes. And Americans' fear of the tomato lasted well into the 1800s until Thomas Jefferson famously ate one in public and lived to tell about it. But before we get into why people feared tomatoes, I want to take a brief look at where they came from originally. Scholars know that tomatoes grew wild in South and Central America, and that the Aztecs loved them. According to manyeats.com, we even get the word tomato from the Aztec word jitomatl. The Aztecs used them in over 50 recipes, including the very first salsa, which was made from tomatoes, peppers, and other seasonings. The Pueblo tribes of North America tried tomatoes a little bit, at least the seeds, and they were the ones who believed that eating the seeds could give a person powers of divination. Scholars also agree that it was the Spanish conquistadors who first brought tomato seeds back to Europe. Possibly even Hernan Cortez, who conquered the Aztecs. Or it could have been Columbus. But either way, the tomato was introduced to the Caribbean islands next. The first written account of tomatoes in Europe didn't happen until 1544. In the account, they're mistakenly called eggplants, but from the description, it's pretty clear that they're tomato seeds. So despite tomatoes being such a huge part of Italian cuisine, they didn't come from there at all. When the tomato reached France, the French, who apparently weren't worried about the fruit poisoning them, named them pomme d'amour, or apple of love, because they thought tomatoes were an aphrodisiac. So how did the apple of love become the poisonous wolf peach? Well, simply because a handful of early botanists made some assumptions that just weren't true. According to PlanetNatural.com, as early as 1597, Britain's John Gerard published an herbal guide that described tomatoes as having a, quote, rank and stinking flavor. Botanists at that time mistakenly classified tomatoes as being part of the deadly nightshade family, which it stayed for over 100 years. Then in 1692, a botanist named Joseph Tournefort reclassified them as an edible nightshade, but his new name for them, Lycopersicon, didn't make people feel much better since it's translated to wolf peach. Now, this came as a double whammy for the tomato. First, people believed that plants in the deadly nightshade family were used solely by witches. And since a lot of European folklore included witches conjuring up werewolves, and since Tournefort had gone and named this poor thing wolf peach, well, you can kind of see why people were terrified. The final nail in the coffin for the unjustly treated tomato happened almost 100 years later in 1753, when botanist Carl Linnaeus reclassified the fruit again, changing its name back to include poison as well as wolf. So now that you know a little bit about the history, it's pretty easy to imagine why the early colonists in the United States would avoid the tomato, since they were mostly Puritans and the fruit was called either the apple of love, which they would have wanted no part of, or a poisonous wolf peach, which may have frightened them even more.
Well, either way, they're not going to want to eat a love apple or a wolf peach. Those were both things that they were very afraid of.
Yeah, kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place on that one.
A tomato and a tomato.
Plus, it didn't help that dozens, if not hundreds of well-to-do people were suddenly dying after eating them. According to uvm.edu, upper-class Europeans were dying from eating tomatoes, but lower-class people were not. It turns out that the upper-class people ate off pewter plates with pewter utensils, which when mixed with the acidity of the tomato was causing lead poisoning. The lower-class folks who didn't own pewter dishware or cutlery were just fine. But initially, people didn't realize this, and tomatoes were once again considered the true poison apple of fruit. That, by the way, is why most people traditionally stir their spaghetti sauce with a wooden spoon.
I always wondered about that.
I just thought it felt homey and natural.
No, it was to keep from
Being poisoned.
Being poisoned by the lead in your utensils.
You've got it. By the 1800s, people here in the U.S. in general weren't eating tomatoes. There were some areas in the southern U.S. where they were, but overall, this country was still anti-tomato. That seemed a little bit silly to Thomas Jefferson, who had been growing tomatoes at Monticello and eating them for years. His garden book records indicated that he planted and harvested and cooked them between 1809 and 1824, and that he served them to his guests. There is one story about Thomas Jefferson causing an absolute scandal when he bit into a tomato in full view of the public of Lynchburg, Virginia. Now, I have to say that historians mostly agree that this is pure legend.
Oh, he didn't really do it?
Not at all.
Oh.
But it does sound good.
And he at least grew them.
Yes, he did. Whether Jefferson really had anything to do with changing the public opinion about tomatoes is up for debate, but if he did, it was a slow change. Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, who, by the way, served until he was well into his 70s, tried his best to end the tomato fear as well. Also a horticulturist, Johnson carried a basket of tomatoes into Salem, New Jersey, stood on the courthouse steps, and proceeded to eat the entire basket one by one as horrified passerbys watched. He didn't die, of course, but 10 years later, the city of Boston was selling tomatoes in their markets. ModernFarmer.com points out that James Mapes, the editor of the book Working Farmer from 1850, wrote, quote, "The tomato was long grown in our gardens as an ornamental plant, under the name of love apple, before being used at all as a culinary vegetable. About 1827 or 28, we occasionally heard of its being eaten in French or Spanish families, but seldom, if ever, by others." End quote. It wasn't until the onset of the Civil War that Americans finally got over their fear of the tomato. Easy to grow and easy to jar or can, tomatoes became a major staple in the soldiers' diets. Canneries sprung up all over the country to meet the demand, and suddenly the deadly nightshade was recognized for what it actually is, an edible nightshade. By the 1870s, a man named A.W. Livingston began experimenting with the tomato hybridization until he had grown the perfect tomato, the Paragon. With its smooth red skin, uniform size, and deeper flavor, his Paragon tomato caught on. Livingston went on to breed and release 35 different tomato varieties between 1870 and 1941. Today, when you see the heirloom tomatoes in the grocery store, the ones that are a little bulbous and all different colors, well, those are most likely some of Livingston's 35 variations. And then in 1895, a man named Joseph Campbell introduced his first condensed canned soup, beefsteak tomato. To this day, Campbell's tomato soup is still in the top 4 of their most popular flavors.
That's surprising to me because there's so many soup flavors out there. But it's, the old standard that everybody knows.
Campbell's.
Tomato soup.
That's right.
With grilled cheese.
Yes.
I think every American child in the country within a certain number of decades has had that lunch.
I would imagine so. I mean, I grew up on it.
We have it for dinner sometimes.
That we do. So finally, the tomato had lost its unfair reputation. Eating one wouldn't turn your blood into acid. Chopping one up in your salad probably isn't going to make you feel overly romantic. And dipping your chips into some salsa isn't going to summon forth a pack of wolves.
It'd be cool if it did.
What, make you feel overly romantic?
No, if you dipped your chips in some salsa and then all of a sudden wolves showed up, that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, right. You'd be sharing your salsa with a pack of wolves.
That's okay.
Right.
They can have them.
But just to be clear, tomatoes are in the nightshade family. There are some internet sites out there that will say that the leaves and stems of the tomatoes are poisonous. And after doing my due diligence, it seems as though they actually are, if you eat tons and tons and tons of tomato stems and leaves. An accidental bite of a leaf in your lasagna isn't going to hurt you one bit. And with over 10,000 varieties of tomatoes out there, why not try as many as you can?
So maybe it's the tomato haters that are making it seem as though the stems and leaves are like instantly toxic because, they're tomato haters and they just want to push their tomato agenda.
Well, that's a great theory, dear. You should look further into that one.
I mean, think about it. How many times have you had a salad anywhere and there was a little bit of tomato leaf in your salad?
Yeah, I've eaten the little small cherry tomatoes, and I just throw the whole thing in my mouth. I don't care if they have leaves on them or stems.
It sounds like you'd have to eat like literally bushels of stems and leaves in order for it to hurt you in any way.
Quite possibly. Maybe that's an experiment we can do at home sometime.
Well, you can tell our anniversary was last week.
Right.
Jeez.
And that takes me to the final part of my tomato story. All along, I've been referring to tomatoes as a fruit. But if it is, why don't we include them in a fruit salad? And why do grocery stores put them with the vegetables? Well, the fruit versus vegetable debate has been going on since 1887, all because of taxes. In the late 1800s, there was a 10% tax on all imported vegetables. Importer John Nix didn't really think that was fair, since fruit was not taxed at all. According to PlanetNatural.com, he sued the Port of New York tax collector, Edward L. Hedden, saying he was being unfairly taxed, since tomatoes were not a vegetable. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Even though tomatoes are technically and botanically a fruit because they have seeds, Supreme Court Justice Horace Gray said, quote, "Botanically speaking, tomatoes are fruits of a vine, just as cucumbers, squashes, beans, and peas. But in the common language of the people, all these are vegetables, which, whether eaten, cooked, or raw, are usually served at dinner, in, with, or after the soup, fish, or meats, which constitute the principal part of the repast, and not like fruits generally as dessert."
So technically tomatoes must be vegetables because fruits are served in desserts, but tomatoes are served during a meal.
That's what they're saying.
Okay.
The Supreme Court ruled that tomatoes are indeed a vegetable, even though they're not, just so the government could tax them. Go figure, right?
Oh, yeah.
Furthering the confusion, Ohio and Tennessee both claim the tomato as their state fruit, while New Jersey claims it as their state vegetable. Arkansas, by the way, has stayed neutral, claiming the tomato as both their state fruit and vegetable.
Well, that's not confusing at all.
No, but hey, way to go, Arkansas. Middle ground. Can't be wrong or right.
We'll just take both.
Today, 86% of all home gardens include tomato plants, making them the #1 homegrown food in U.S. households. But the majority of our retail tomatoes come from Mexico. I know. Go figure.
Yes.
Well, you know how it is. They're just screwing our farmers.
Well, yes, the majority of fruits and vegetables in our supermarkets in the U.S. are imported from other countries.
It makes no sense.
I know. It's a whole supply and demand thing.
Americans spend a little under $6 billion a year on fresh tomatoes at the grocery store and $50 billion on tomato products, like pasta sauces. So it seems as though we've come a very long way from fearing the deadly, poisonous wolf peach.
I kind of like the name Wolf Peach.
So don't I.
I think it'd be cool to go into the grocery store and see jars of Wolf Peach sauce where, the spaghetti sauce or tomato sauce used to be.
Yeah, I think it'd be more interesting than just seeing a big tomato on the can.
I know. You could have wolves on the graphics, and it'd be cool.
Well, that it would. Well, maybe you can start a petition.
You know what I could see? I could see a small batch local entrepreneur starting a new collection of Wolf Peach sauces. That would be like a niche.
New brand.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it'll give one of our listeners an idea.
Maybe.
Somebody that's really into tomatoes. I like them. I don't like them more than maybe once a week. But yeah, a good tomato once in a while hits the spot. They make me break out.
Yes, but you also go on and on sometimes about BLTs and how much you love them and want to have them.
Right.
And the tea is a very integral part of the BLT.
That it is. You can't have the BLT without the tea.
It would just be a BL.
Well, with that said, tell them about our sources, honey.
As always, if you'd like to know more about Blackwell Island or about the poisonous wolf peach, you can always check out our sources in our show notes.
Well, with that said, that's the end of our episode. Join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
And thank you all for your continued support.
See you next week for an all-new episode.